About a year after Warrior Within was initially met with tepid reception, Ubisoft released a game more reminiscent of Sands of Time while incorporating some elements of the second game and its own original ideas. Enter Prince of Persia: The Two Thrones, the concluding chapter of the saga. Also subtitled Rival Swords when ported to the PSP and Wii 2 years later. Not exactly sure why they renamed it, but this was the same year that Assassin's Creed debuted. My theory is that this is around the starting point of Ubisoft's long streak of stupid shit. The game... wait, is there anything else? Did I cover everything? It's gotta be more than that. I covered that. Something about steamed hams and Burger King foot lettuce? I guess I wrote that when I was drunk. So yeah, looks like that's everything. I mean, Two Thrones did better critically and financially than Warrior Within did, but there's not really a whole lot special to go over about the game's production history. So I suppose let's begin the review? Go! Starting right after the ending to Warrior Within, where the prince basically fucked everything up like an idiot, Two Thrones makes the good ending canon and the bad ending sort of a what-if scenario. The prince and Kylina are on their way to Babylon, only to discover the city in flames and under attack. Their ship gets wrecked, washing the two of them ashore, with Kylina being kidnapped and the prince in pursuit, all the while sneaking and fighting through the city and catching a glimpse of all the destruction and torture the enemy forces have inflicted upon Babylon. As it would turn out, preventing the creation of the Sands of Time pretty much makes it so the events from... well, didn't happen. As a result, the prince never went to Azad, never met Farah, never styled his hair so it's not a fucking mess, and never killed the vizier, who turns out to be the one leading the attack on Babylon. Somehow he survived this long despite being horribly ill because, I guess medical science is really advanced in this franchise? A bunch of shit happens where the vizier kills Kylina, unleashing a bunch of sand that transforms his Ajit Pai looking ass into the god form of a typical Final Fantasy villain. I'll roll with it, I guess. Also, your arm gets horribly mangled into a bunch of sharp blades, which even just looking at makes me cringe in pain. Sand infects you, which gives you multiple personality disorder and a voice in your head? Alright then. It could happen. Following a bit of an odd setup is the prince fighting through all the vizier's army to reach and kill him once more. All the while meeting Farah again, and the voice in his head being a big fat meanie. Similar to Sands of Time, the entire plot of the game is told through narration, though instead of being from the prince's point of view, Kylina's spirit is the one telling the tale, making the prince more of a character in somebody else's story. It's the same concept, but with a more nuanced execution that gives Two Thrones its own narrative style different from both games before. While the story in Warrior Within was about the prince defying his fate and undoing what's been set in the timeline, the story for Two Thrones in turn goes over the consequences of altering the course of time and how disastrous they can truly be. It's kinda like the butterfly effect, except at least 80% less retarded. In both previous games, the prince solved the conflicts by undoing everything, and both times, shit only got worse. Two Thrones is about the prince realizing, hey, maybe some things should be left as they are, and some mistakes are better off living with instead of undoing. Along the journey, the prince also faces an internal conflict about the true nobility of his intentions. Sure, he's fighting to stop the vizier's attack on Babylon, a goal notably less selfish than the one he had in Warrior Within, but it's less about whether he's doing the right thing and more about if he's doing it for the right reasons. Basically, is he going to kill the vizier to save his people, or to serve his own pride and glory? One side has him influenced and belittled into keeping focus on the vizier by the voice inside of his head named the Dark Prince. On the other side, Farah urges the prince to help his people in a way that's more personal and immediate than just trying to fix everything all at once by slaying the vizier. The banter between the prince and the Dark Prince ranges from funny to satisfying when the Dark Prince is told to fuck off. Between the prince and Farah, the game has both characters meet at an older age in the timeline, which again uses a similar idea from Sands of Time, but with more nuance. It all leads to an ending that's a perfect conclusion to the prince's character arc and brings the whole narrative full circle back to the beginning of Sands of Time, essentially making the whole story a continuous cycle. Though I can recall one part that really annoyed me for how dumb and unnecessary it is.
To those watching, are you familiar with the liar revealed cliche? If the answer is yes, I am very, 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 very sorry.
At one point in the game, Farah discovers that you're part sand monster, and right then and there, she hates you for some amount of time before going, "Oh, I'm sorry, I was dumb." The story treats it like the prince lied about this, even though that's a complete load of horseshit. He probably could have been more upfront about being a half-sand demon thing, but nothing beforehand indicated that he was being dishonest about it. I hate this cliche enough as it is, and the game only makes it worse by having the writing take a huge dip in quality, all for superfluous character drama that only lasts about 5 minutes before Farah realizes that she was being a dumb bitch and everything is all well and good again. Bite me.
The conclusion to the trilogy is engaging, and it does tie up everything nicely. The setup is kind of odd, and that one moment is the equivalent of hepatitis, but it does feel like that Ubisoft knew when and where to stop. Those were different times, people. Very, 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 very different times.
With Two Thrones being the final game in the series to be released on 6th gen hardware, it feels like they went all out with making the game the most polished and visually stunning. Gotta say, they knocked it straight out of the fucking park. Even the first pre-rendered cutscene gives this off with how beautiful it is. They've come a long way from awkward stiff animation, that much is certain. At least on PC, it's the first game in the series that lets you set the resolution to 1080p at default without having to download some external mod or program or whatever to alter the game. It definitely helps to give Two Thrones more of a clear picture than the previous games, if only by a little bit. The overall scale of the game feels a lot more grand, which makes sense as you're traversing an entire city as opposed to just a palace or island. You get such a wide view of Babylon when parkouring across rooftops to both admire the massive civilization, yet be distraught to see it in such a horrific state. The increased texture quality and environmental detail does wonders in rendering the setting, and obviously the environment is made more gorgeous by being littered with fire, rubble, and corpses. Hear me out, put that on a postcard and you've got yourself a hot spot for tourists. But in all seriousness, it very much sells the feeling of this once grand city having gone to hell. Though enemies in the background tormenting civilians by just bitch slapping them can be kinda hard to take seriously. Like, oh shit, watch out for this guy, you don't want to fuck with him. I thought random dipshits that leave nasty comments on YouTube were threatening, but this guy, oh boy, he'd make me shit my pants if I was in his presence. The sounds of fire and distant cries for help make it feel like all hope is lost, with the mood transitioning from the heat of attack to completely desolate as you go through the game. The improved visuals and great use of lighting can lead to some truly gorgeous scenery, in spite of everything being in shambles. From my perspective, it kinda feels like they're trying to convey that even within all of the chaos, hope still remains and all is not yet lost.
And then, centuries later in the future, all of that hope will just completely fade away when people begin to eat Tide Pods. That is the moment you realize we have failed. That is the moment you realize we should have gone extinct a long, long, long time ago. That is the moment you realize we are nothing more than an unfortunate mistake that the world has been cursed with.
Improvements to the sound design make it so every attack on impact gives off more of a punch, and every physical impact outside of that feels a lot stronger than it would have in either game before. In general, Two Thrones is definitely the strongest when it comes to visual and sound design, at least on a technical level, and I probably have the fewest issues with it out of the whole trilogy. Most, if not all, of the technical hiccups I experienced with Warrior Within seem to be gone too, so that's also a plus. It's not entirely perfect though. I've noticed that if you rewind time a little bit after a cutscene ends, the audio for said cutscene starts from the beginning and plays all the way through while you're in gameplay. It's easy to avoid by waiting long enough after the cutscene ends, but in the event that you do rewind too soon, this happens.
The prince was cast to his death into a pit of darkness, robbed of Farah, distanced from the vizier. He had been warned that his journey would not end well.
What?
The prince was cast to his death into a pit of darkness, robbed of Farah, distanced from the vizier.
Well, I guess we can't have a Prince of Persia game without some way of completely fucking up the audio. It could be that I wasn't paying attention to this in the previous games, so what I'm about to say could apply to them too, but I noticed that Two Thrones has some pretty bad issues with clipping. I get that hair isn't exactly a hard object, but it's still solid, and I don't think it's supposed to pass through your shoulders. I'm no physics expert, but just a hunch. The soundtrack in Two Thrones I also found to be the weakest of the entire trilogy. I get the feeling with this game they focused more on making the OST atmospheric over memorable, which it does okay, but it lacks anything like the feeling of enchantment in Sands of Time's music or the unstoppable badass feel from Warrior Within. Pretty often it just feels like a typical by-the-numbers score that you'd hear in every big-budget film.
Sure, it may falter a bit with music, but art direction is as solid as ever, and a lot of the rough patches from both prior games seem to be ironed out. So yeah, it good. 8 out of 7.
If you've played one or both of the prior games, which you probably should if you're playing the final game in a trilogy, you'll most definitely know the fundamentals of platforming and combat, unless you're Dory, in which case you've probably forgotten, and I am very sorry. Every button has the same function from both prior games, with the combat enhancements from Warrior Within being brought over, meaning you still have a really complex moveset and can dual-wield an enemy's weapon when they die. On the other hand, the level design harkens back to Sands of Time, with the entire game being set on a linear track rather than an open map setting. Some may view this as a bit of a step back, but I'm fine with it personally. Nothing against Warrior Within, but I honestly just prefer a more linear design structure for a game like this. While many of the core features from Two Thrones are brought over from past games, there are a number of new ideas and alterations it brought to the table. There's simple stuff like new traps and different mechanisms in the environment that add a couple new forms of platforming, but then there's bigger additions. The camera seems to be positioned more behind the prince and synchronized with whatever movement he makes. For example, when you jump, the camera follows the exact arc of said jump, and when you run across the wall for an extended period of time, the camera begins tilting toward the side. I think it's a nice subtle way to immerse the player more into the action by conveying an illusion of movement. Though with that being said, I'm not sure if this is just me, but manually turning the camera left to right felt really slow, even when I cranked sensitivity up to maximum. It's not too big a deal when you're moving, as the camera tends to follow you really closely when you make a turn, but when you're trying to get a look around the environment, fucking rip. A new addition to combat is that of stealth kills. If you sneak up on an enemy from above or behind, you get an opportunity through a QTE to instantly kill them. Whenever you see a flash of light, that's your cue to press the attack button. It may take one or a few strikes depending on which enemy you're going after. Those archers go down easier than PlayStation Network, but you'll need to perform a ballet dance with the armored guys before they're content with leaving this mortal plane of existence. On occasion, the expected reaction time can feel a bit too demanding, but there's only one button that you'll ever need to press for these sequences, and being able to properly execute them is a pretty satisfying way to avoid combat. They thankfully don't disrupt the flow of the game either. Sure, none of the stealth mechanics will exactly blow you away or anything, but it's a cool addition and there's some really clever level design that allows for you to more easily execute the stealth kills. QTEs are also implemented into the boss encounters, which are probably my favorite selection out of the trilogy. Looking back, while Warrior Within's boss selection was good, they all focused a bit too exclusively on the combat aspect of the game, while Two Thrones does a bit more to incorporate climbing and platforming into most of the fights. QuickTime events are often used for doing damage or initiating another phase of the battle. There's a good variety of bosses, including big, dumb, ugly dude, some random bitch, two assholes who keep killing me, and the Vizier, all of which have their own unique methods to beating them. At certain points of the game, the Dark Prince will take over your body, which makes you stronger in combat, at the cost of your health draining away. Only way to quell the demon is to submerge yourself in water, making the Dark Prince the biggest non-threat ever. All that you'd have to do to fight his control is drink literally anything, jump in a puddle, take a shower, or anyways, I do like these segments as it's a pretty satisfying way to easily cut down enemies that normally take a lot more effort, but they can drag out when a large amount of easily disposable enemies keep coming in, and the rate that your health drains maybe could have been a bit more lenient.
Now let's go over the segments with the chariot. They are not very good.
Why do these exist? Just why? Did the game not have enough new ideas already? Was it really necessary to force in some boring automated chase sequence with awful controls where it's really easy to crash into shit and die? There's only 2 in the whole game, praise the Lord for that being the case, but they're easily the worst parts of the game, and I'd argue even the entire trilogy. Finally, I do take a bit of an issue with the final stretch in Two Thrones, as I feel it's a bit too much like Sands of Time's final stretch. You're climbing up the outside of a large tower to get to the top. Farah is in danger and you're in pursuit of her. You fight off enemies while wielding a sword that kills them in one strike, and you encounter the Vizier at the end of it all. I wouldn't call it a ripoff as there are notable differences, but it feels like they just started retreading old ideas around the end when they hadn't done so before.
The new gameplay additions are kinda hit or miss, but the ones that hit are really effective. Anything else I could go over, I've already covered in my Sands of Time and Warrior Within reviews, and if I were to go over them again, it'd just be redundant. Not that that's a bad thing, mind you, I just don't really have anything new to add to what I've already covered.
Being honest, I think I'd consider Two Thrones my favorite game of the series. I imagine somebody could make the case for one of the prior games being better, but for me, the game took the things I liked most from Sands of Time and Warrior Within individually, and put them all together into one game, even if some of the newer elements could have received tighter execution. It's a really fun action platformer just like its predecessors, in addition to being a fantastic conclusion to the saga. But hey, regardless of how I'd rate the trilogy by each individual game, they're all really high among some of my favorite games of all time. I'd recommend Two Thrones as equally as the other two. They may each have their own share of flaws, but it's hard to focus on that when they have so many more strong points.
I do want to review Forgotten Sands and the 2008 game in the future, but those can wait a bit. For now, my attention is going to be directed toward other types of videos. I am a bit overdue on a countdown, so look forward to that. Until then, take care. Thanks for watching.